Welcome to the Neurofaith Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kirk Thompson, and we are here to explore what it means to live at the intersection of emerging scientific discoveries about the mind and following and being formed by Jesus, and how that can lead us into a world of greater human flourishing. The title for this, our first season, is Thinking Well During a Pandemic. We're eager to hear from our guests not only about the work they are doing, but how it speaks to what it means for us to thrive in our present particular moment. Today, my guest on the Neurofaith Podcast is psychiatrist Dan Siegel. Dr. Siegel is clinical professor of psychiatry at the UCLA School of Medicine and the founding co-director of the Mindful Awareness Research Center at UCLA. An award-winning educator, he is a distinguished fellow of the American Psychiatric Association and recipient of several honorary fellowships. Dr. Siegel is also the executive director of the MindSight Institute, an educational organization which offers online learning and in-person seminars that focus on how the development of mindsight in individuals, families, and communities can be enhanced by examining the interface of human relationships and basic biological processes. Besides all this, I count him as a friend and a colleague, and as an older brother to me in the field in which we work, and the person who in many ways helped shift my own professional and personal journey, now more than 17 years ago when we first met. It is, I think, only appropriate that this, our inaugural episode of this podcast series, be shared with Dr. Siegel, who I'm now just delighted to welcome to the podcast. Dr. Siegel, welcome.
Dr. Thompson, great to be here with you. Thanks for having me.
As I told friends of mine, I said, I just really look forward to the opportunity to talk to Dan because, when I listen to you speak, when you and I are speaking, I'm aware that I'm not getting an artificial version of the stuff that you're talking about. I'm getting the genuine article. I'm speaking to someone who lives what he talks about. And as such, just listening to you, being with you in the room, in and of itself, has the capacity for really, I would say, being healing and transformational. And so every time we get the chance to talk, I just so look forward to the opportunity. And so grateful to have you here on this, our first episode. I would love for the audience to first hear from you a little bit about your story that led you to the work that you do. And then we'll get more into the questions of what is the mind? What does it mean for us to be integrated whole people, and how are there different domains that lead us there? So tell us, I would love for them to hear more about what brought you to where you are.
Well, thanks, Kurt. Thanks for the friendship and collegial connection we've had over all these years. And, I want to thank everyone for listening. It's a nice place to start, I think, when you ask about the personal meaning of it, even the personal meaning of the listening to stories of how things unfold or ideas people are presenting. So, as I bring up the personal, I'll just say this, that I think the journey for any of us from, conception and even before conception to existing out in the world after we leave our mother's womb, is a huge moment of transition from a kind of, if you want to say it this way, a wholeness where we're connected to our maternal environment without any real sense of needing to do anything. We're just literally simply being. And that departure from that state of wholeness, a wholeness of being, I think in many ways leads people to a sense of, disconnection, of not being whole, and you're outside in the world. Now you have to work for a living, where you've got to breathe, and when you're lonely, you have to call out for connection. When you're needing to be comforted, you need to show signs of distress. All these things you have to do. There's a lot of doing. And in many ways, we go away from being a human being. So for this body called Dan, and lately on Zoom calls, I'm putting at the bottom, not Dan Siegel, but ABCD, a body called Dan. That's abbreviation for, because it's just emerging that, we do have a body that forms. And I think we can really learn a lot. And I certainly did myself, that I think the journey for me of growing up in the United States, growing up with white skin in a white dominant country, but then not even having to think about that. My family wasn't religious of any sort, but was interested in how to contribute to the world in various ways. So I didn't have a theistic background, but I was really, in many ways, what people later on would use the word spiritual. I was a very spiritual kid. I was very connected to nature, very much in feeling that there was something much larger than the skin encased body that was the experience of being. And yet, my teachers would keep on calling me Danny, and, friends would call me Danny, and my parents would call me Danny. So it seemed to have a solidity to it, this idea that there was a person with that name. And I think the first time something really momentous happened, besides spending times often at the side of creeks and wondering why this body was different from, let's say, a newt that was there, or a bird, or a lizard that was scampering around. I think the first time something really happened was just right before I turned 20. I had an accident. I was working for the World Health Organization and in Mexico. And I was studying folk healers who, were tapping into a kind of mystical energy and knowledge that was passed through the generations in the oral tradition. And I was studying them and how technology, that is the building of a dam and the advancements of modern society, were affecting the culture in a village that was just a sample village that I was living in. But in the course of doing that, I was going to interview someone who was a curandera, who was called the Queen of the Mushrooms, and the use of psilocybin-based mushrooms was a part of the cultural practice there. Anyway, on the journey to go up there, I was riding a horse with some colleagues, and the saddle on the horse went to the horse's belly, and I was dragged for a long time, they say, and they thought I had died. But I hadn't died. And then they thought I had broken my neck, but I hadn't broken my neck. But I basically destroyed a lot of my face, broke my nose, lost my teeth, all this really pretty terrible stuff. But the biggest thing that happened, and related to your question, was I lost any sense of who I was. And yet I was wide awake and super alert and in a sense, sensing the water that was passing by my broken teeth, or the taste of food that they would give me to try to eat. Everything was brand new. And in the newness, it had this certain vitality to it. There was a kind of way of being alive and being also connected to everything that was happening without a feeling of separation. And after about 24 hours, the identity of Dan came back, and I remembered who I was, what my history was, and all that stuff. And I was flown back to the United States, got, everything fixed up. But what didn't get fixed up was this nagging feeling that separate identity that we use names to indicate had a solidity to it. So I think for a while, I thought it was an existential issue, like I almost died, like a near-death thing maybe, or maybe head trauma, or I don't know. But there was this kind of deep peacefulness, being able to tap back into that nameless, timeless, very awake, very alert state. And that just kind of stayed with me. So I thought, okay, that's kind of a quirky side effect of almost dying. And I never talked to anyone about it. And then it wasn't for 30 years later, after I'd been, a psychiatrist and all this stuff, even gotten into the field of mindfulness by accident, that I met with my first formal mindfulness person, Jack Kornfield, and we were having lunch. He asked me to teach at a conference on spirituality, actually, which I had never done before. And we're eating lunch, and he said, well, how'd you learn about mindfulness? I said, I don't know anything about mindfulness. I don't even really know what it is. He goes, no. He goes, you know what it is. I said, well, I actually don't know what it is. And he goes, no, you do know what it is. And so for some reason, for the first time in 30 years, I told him the story of the horse accident. I don't even know why, but it came up, and we both had to go on, our way doing what we were doing. He calls me up a couple hours later. I was finishing the book Mindsight then in a little cabin somewhere. And he calls up. I remember the phone ringing, and he goes, I can't stop thinking about what you said. I said, what? Why can't you stop thinking about it? And he goes, the horse accident. I said, what about the horse accident? He goes, don't you understand people will meditate for decades to try to get what you got by accident? And I go, what are you talking about? And he goes, they try to get that. I said, get that. They're going to try to break their face by meditating. Right? What do you mean?
Saddle up, boys. Saddle up.
I know. And he goes, no, he goes, losing personal identity. I said, why is that a good thing? He goes, and he's laughing his head off. He goes, oh my God, we need to talk. I said, yeah, we do. Because you're not making, it doesn't make any sense to me what you're saying. So that, over the last, I guess now it's been now it's been 15 years since then. I've gotten to know the philosophy of contemplative practice, which I was unaware of before in my ignorance. And before that, I had befriended an Irish Catholic priest, John O'Donoghue, who, as a Catholic priest, he was steeped in, of course, Christianity, but he was also an Irish mystic. He was a poet, and he was a philosopher. He had his doctoral degree in philosophy. So, he didn't know anything about the brain or any of the stuff I was trained in. So the two of us were quite a funny pair. He used to call me his twin, and I would call him my twin. But we didn't look anything alike. And we were from very different backgrounds. So I learned there about Christian theology, and I learned from John, the overlap for him of deep Christian contemplative practice with mysticism, which, from John's point of view, as an Irish mystic, was about believing, in John's word, the reality of the invisible. And that began a conversation with John as we would teach together over and over again, trying to find a common ground, or what E.O. Wilson called consilience, among different pursuits of understanding of reality. So for John O'Donoghue and myself, it was, a blending of John's different backgrounds with this field of interpersonal neurobiology, which, for me, when I became trained in medicine, I couldn't stand how unempathic my teachers were. I dropped out for a while and then came back with this word mindsight, meaning, there's an inner nature of the mind that is really important to acknowledge for patients and for students and for anybody. And that's when you asked me how did it begin professionally. It began for me long before I met Jack Cornfield, and even before I met John O'Donoghue, where as a young psychiatry trainee, I just felt like the statement that mind was simply brain activity was simply overly simplistic.
Right,
it was reductionistic and inaccurate, and in fact unhelpful. And if you really took it all the way, it was actually harmful. So that we're talking like the middle 80s, when I first started training, and then I thought, okay, well, I'm a scientist. I was trained as a scientist, and I was a physician, like you are, Kurt. And I thought, okay, well, how do I use deep scientific rigor from a Western science point of view anyway, to look at the question of, is the mind simply a synonym for brain activity? And that led to a whole bunch of things we can talk about, but that ultimately led to a definition of the mind that was trying to be very diplomatically connecting to all the different fields initially of science. It turns out to be a definition extremely useful for therapists and extremely useful even for people in religion and spiritual and contemplative practices. So, and indigenous teachings too. So it's been really interesting to not have that intention originally, but rather try to say, if we stay grounded in people's actual experience, how do we actually bring us all together to collaborate?
Right. So, I want to just highlight that in the West in particular, but not, and now when we say the West, in many respects, we're really talking about the entire world, because so much of the Western culture has permeated so many other places, not everywhere, but in many places. We often, when someone says it, and when we Christians, quoting the Torah and quoting Jesus in the Gospels, when we hear Jesus say, "Love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your mind, with all your strength, and all of your soul," there is this sense in which we often reduce that. When I think of my mind, I think of the thing with which I do my thinking. That's my rational brain. That's kind of how most people, when we imagine the mind, we don't think about other dimensions. And so this journey that you've been on really, brought you to a place where you began to think more in a much richer, nuanced way about how we think about, first of all, about what the mind actually is. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about how you would describe the mind and why the way that definition emerged for you. How does that make a difference practically for us?
Yeah, well, thank you, Kurt. I mean, the this modern contemporary, cultural stance that may have derived from Western countries, European countries, extending then to the United States. And I agree with you; it's not just the West now. So I try to just use the word modern to refer to that, but the way of thinking that reduces things to their parts and then examines the details of the parts. Sometimes it's called reductionistic thinking because it's reducing. Sometimes it's called linear thinking because it's like A led to B, led to C, led to D. So if you just change C, you'll fix the whole problem of D. This is why it's called linear like that. It's very different from what's called a systems way of thinking, where you see the whole, not just the parts, and you look at the profound way in which these parts are interacting with one another. And something that Buckminster Fuller talks about, the synergy that arises where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So in many ways, modern Western science is a reductionistic effort. It doesn't have to be, but it can lean that way. And when it does, it gets very sure of itself. I know A led to B, so therefore B is solely caused by A. And you go, well, actually, there's a bunch of things like C and D that are actually going back and influencing B. It's not just A. And the arrows of directionality are in many directions, So that's one way to say the difference between systems thinking and linear thinking. So we begin with that, and then we say, well, all right, so then what is this thing called mind? And, at a minimum, we can talk about descriptions that over, centuries have been used to describe mental life, like subjective experience, like the feeling you may have when Kurt, you say to me, good morning or something, or the feeling you may have when you're looking at the sunrise. So that feeling is subjectively sensed, meaning you, the subject of observation, are observing the sunset. You have a feeling tone of being alive. And we just call that subjectivity or subjective experience. Some people would simply call it a sensation, a felt sense, some people would call it. And then you would say, well, that felt sense is real, but it can only be known by the sensor, the person who is sensing it, right? So then we call it subjective. You are the subject sensing it, so it's subjective. Sometimes it's called first person. And then if we systematically want to gather how people try to describe their first person experience, then when we've received first person data like that, we call it second person data, because we're hearing you're trying to translate the felt sense that's not even in language form into language or music or dancing or whatever you're doing. It's not the thing itself. It's a step removed, second person, receiving it from you. Then once we try to objectify stuff and quantify it and study it that way, where we don't even need first person reports, we call that third person data. So in certain ways, an effort to understand the mind requires that you go across these three layers of data collection. And the reductionistic view would say, oh, well, all subjective experience is brain firing. Well, you and I both know in working with someone who's suicidal, if they say, Dr. Thompson, I'm feeling a lot of despair. I have a gun here on the other end of the phone, and I called you because I just need to really call you, but I feel so much despair. If you were to say to that person, your serotonin levels in your prefrontal cortex are probably a little low right now, and they would then kill themselves. Mm. In contrast, if you said, Dan, I really hear that sense of hopelessness you're feeling, and can you tell me more? And I said, oh yeah, I don't think there's any future, and I'm just so overwhelmed by everything. You go, wow, that overwhelming feeling can just feel like it takes all the energy out of you, and you can feel like there's no future. I hear you, and that must be so painful for you. Let's say you say that to me. I'm going to feel joined with you, understood by you, empathically resonating with you. You're going to be compassionately being open to sensing my suffering, and in that connection, I start to feel soothed. And my disconnection is being repaired, and I'm not alone anymore. So if you had mentioned the serotonin levels in my brain, it wouldn't have done the trick. So at a very minimum, we could say subjective sensation is not the same as brain firing, even if it were only dependent on what happened in your head. Now, that's just one thing. We then say, well, how do you know you're feeling that despair? Or how would you know to say those things? Then we have consciousness that gives us choice. So that's an amazing thing, to be aware, not just to sense it, but to be aware, hey, I'm sensing it. And, we're called, Homo sapiens sapiens with two sapiens sapere, to know, we know. Then there's information processing where we can make words like suffering and despair and connection and consciousness. And those words are a way of taking energy flow and turning it into a formation that has symbolic value. So we call it information, but it's always energy flow, amazingly. So for me, those three things, subjective experience, consciousness, information processing, are what for hundreds and hundreds of years people have described as mental life. Maybe not in those terms, but basically that's what they're talking about. So for me, while that was a description, it didn't say what the stuff of the mind was. So it's a long story that I can repeat if you want, but I don't need to repeat it here. I wrote a whole book called Mind about it. But basically, I had a group of 40 scientists. They couldn't agree what the mind was. Everyone could agree what the brain was. So I had to come up with a definition. And it was in the early 90s, when it was the beginning of the decade of the brain, but it was just after, in the 1980s, a new field of science had emerged, the mathematics of certain kinds of systems called complex systems. And what was clear in the mathematics of how these systems that had a number of qualities, including being nonlinear, meaning small inputs led to large and difficult to predict results, in those studies of complexity had a fundamental finding that was, I think, earth-shattering, which is that complex systems have something called emergence. And that emergence is, for a linear thinker, is like illogical, doesn't make sense. They poo-poo it and say, oh, it's ridiculous.
The data doesn't add up.
It doesn't add up, what's going on. But if you look at complexity science and the mathematics of why this happens, it basically says that, let's think about water. Water, for a reductionistic linear thinker, is 2 atoms of hydrogen, 1 atom of oxygen, H2, that's the 2, O, right? O is for oxygen, H is for hydrogen. That's water. And a linear thinker says, what more do you want to know? It's water. You go, well, actually, water has a quality called wetness. There's an emergent property of wetness that comes from the interaction of the components. So I say all this because I had these scientists in this room and I couldn't figure out what to say to them. So I'm reading these math books on complex systems, and I'm trained as an attachment researcher studying parent-child relationships. And I was working as a therapist with, with patients suffering with all this stuff. And my teacher of neuroscience had gotten the Nobel Prize when I was in school with him, David Hubel, for showing that the kinds of energy that you send into the eye will shape the structural connective growth of the brain. That got him a Nobel Prize, a life's work in that area. And for me, it was like, I don't want to say a no-brainer, but it was pretty clear that you couldn't reduce the mind to just the brain because you had to deal with energy flow that was coming from outside the organism. And as an attachment researcher, what I was studying was energy flow patterns that were shared, and that's called communication. And it's the basis of what we call a loving relationship. So, I was both a scientist and a clinician, and at that time I had a kid, my first child. So I said to the group, well, what if the mind could be thought of this way? And this is what emerged when I walked at the beach once and was seeing these waves coming into the shore. And I realized that the water crashing at my feet was not composed of the same molecules as what I saw 100 yards out before as the wave came toward me. But what was coming from 100 yards out was energy pushing the molecules, so that the molecules out 100 yards were staying there, but the energy was flowing through them. So then, energy was, you could just see it as a wave. So then I said, well, maybe the mind's fundamental stuff is energy, but some of it kind of swirls in symbolic form. So, hey, that's information. So let's just say energy and information. And because it changes, let's call it flow. And then if you look at the properties of complex systems, which are, that they are open to influences from outside of themselves. And just think, for any of us, if you might be an open system, and most people would say, yeah, I'm a part of an open system. The second thing is, are you capable of being chaotic?
Mm.
And I know yesterday I had a wildly chaotic day,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Phyllis, my
maybe
wife Phyllis would affirm, yes, Kurt's capable of being chaotic.
chaotic, right? And
Yeah.
sometimes you got to go there,
Yeah.
right? So chaos, capable, and open. But the third factor that some mathematicians think is the most important is called nonlinear, which means like if something happens first thing in the morning, like this morning I got a text from a neighbor concerned about something we're doing on our property, that sets the tone for the whole day in ways that I couldn't have predicted. Right. And they can have big impacts. Right. So that means you're nonlinear. So if you're listening to Kurt and to me and you feel you're nonlinear, you're chaos capable, and you're open, that means you are a complex system, or you're a part of a complex system, however you want to view that. And then you go, okay, well, if you're a complex system, what do we know about you? In this universe, we know if you're a complex system, number one, you have emergent properties. That is, the elements that are making up you in their most fundamentally dividable way are not going to explain the emergent aspect of things that are part of you as a system. And one of those, I'm suggesting, are the properties of mind, so that subjective experience could be a property. Maybe you hear my dog barking out there. That creates a subjective sense in me, like, oh, she should, go to a different part of the yard, which I might have to step away and do if she keeps on barking. She's probably hearing my voice and wants to play catch. She's a great catcher. Oh my God. And then the second thing is, the ability to have awareness may be an emergent property of energy flow, which we can talk about in a moment. And then, of course, information processing, that third facet we've talked about, that by definition is an emergent aspect of energy and information flow. That's almost a way of defining what information processing is. So then you go, okay, what more is there? And now here's what more there is from going to this complex systems view. Complex systems have what are called self-organizing processes. That is, it's sort of counterintuitive, but emerging from a complex system is a process that regulates its own becoming. And then, of course, as it's regulating its own becoming, it's now continuing to emerge from that which is already regulated. So that's probably why it's counterintuitive, and why, for the most part, no one's talked about the mind being, and here's the definition, the emergent, self-organizing, and here's really the part that gets people agitated sometimes, embodied, so not just in skull, not just in your head, but fully embodied, and relational. So its location is not limited by skull or skin. And it's embodied and relational. What is it doing? It's regulating energy and information flow. So I went back to this group of 40 scientists. They had never thought of a definition of mind in general, and they hadn't thought of that one in particular. And 100% of them, I mean, literally 40 out of 40 voted, yes, we can go along with that definition. And that was back in 1992. And since that time, for 30 years, I've been looking for someone to offer an alternative definition, and then we can have a fun discussion and debate about it. But actually, in 30 years, what's become apparent is there are no definitions of the mind. There are descriptions, descriptions galore, but no definitions. So what this definition does is it not only says what one of the four facets of mind might be, but it's also saying that optimal self-organization is the basis for flourishing.
So, Dan, I'm going to interrupt you for just a second. I think you have been, again, kind of diving pretty deep into these scientific principles. I know that in the course of the time that I have dipped my toe into this work and continue to pay attention to your charting a path for us as we explore these things, I think of this emergent, not to overuse the word, but this emergent definition of the mind being this embodied and relational process. At least this is what I learned in the work with you, this embodied and relational process that emerges from within and between brains, whose task in some respects is to regulate the flow of energy and information. We have all these different, it's not just my thinking brain, it is these emerging complex elements that are interacting with each other within me, but also between you and me. Even right now, like my mind is being shaped by you while we are speaking. And I'm really curious about this when we are working with this definition for our audience who's wondering, okay, like I just had a fight with my spouse, I just had a difficulty, a rupture with my teenage son, with my daughter. How does knowing these things practically, boots on the ground, how do we take these concepts that you're describing and put them into some practice day-to-day basis that would help our audience say, oh, this is why this definition can be so meaningful to me this afternoon on Thursday?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I wear a number of hats, and one of the hats, as this preface to what we're talking about in terms of practical aspects, one of those hats is to be a theoretician and a scientist, looking deeply at systems of knowledge, and not just Western science, but now looking at spiritual practices, contemplative practices, indigenous knowledge. So we could talk about that too if we'd like. And looking at systems thinking. So that's one thing. Then I'm also, I'm a parent, a father. I'm a husband. We've been married now 35 years. I'm a therapist, and I'm a physician. All these things, many of those things you and I share. So when this definition came up in '92. Right away, because I'd be meeting with this group as part of my academic appointment, but I was also a practicing therapist. I said, well, how does this apply? So the question that comes up is, well, what is a healthy mind? When you just see descriptions of the mind, nothing pops out. You can make all sorts of statements, but they're just opinions, really. But in this definition, there's a natural, logical statement. You say, well, what is optimal self-organization made of? And it's a really incredibly elegant and simple mathematical statement that optimal self-organization basically allows a complex system to unfold, to emerge with harmony. Whereas if optimal self-organization is thwarted in some way, that we'll describe in a moment, it either leads to states of chaos or to states of extended rigidity. So we all get a little rigid, all get a little chaotic. But I'm talking about long-term rigidity, like people get depressed for months at a time, or people who enter manic states for weeks at a time. That would be an example of chaos. For the mania and depression would be the rigidity. But in looking at this, it resonated. I don't know if this is how you felt it, Kurt, but for me, I'd always wondered, and even mentioned it to my supervisors who just would roll their eyes and go, I don't know what you're talking about. I said, I know there's the DSM, and I know I have all these symptoms and that comprise the syndromes that I have to memorize to get my board certification, which I had done. I get all that. And I was then even a training director in child and adolescent psychiatry, and I was supposed to teach it. And I don't know if this was simplistic thinking, I would say to my supervisors, everybody, without exception, when they were suffering, they either had chaos or rigidity or some combination of both. And I would say this to my supervisor, I don't know what you're talking about. But when I read the mathematics of complex systems, it said optimal self-organization moves between one extreme, which is chaos, when it's not optimally organizing, or the other extreme of rigidity when it's not optimally self-organizing. So it's like a river where the central flow of the river is harmony that has these 5 qualities that come from the math of complex systems: flexible, adaptive, coherent, energized, and stable. That spells the word faces if you lay them out that way. So this faces flow of harmony is basically, for me, the best definition, and it comes from math, of well-being. And you say, well, how do I achieve that? How does a complex system achieve it? And it's incredibly simple. It differentiates, that is, it allows its components to be unique and different as they unfold over time. And then it links those differentiated elements to each other. So I went in working with mathematicians and I said, well, what do you call that process of balancing differentiation on the one hand and linkage on the other? They go, we don't have a name for it. It's just called linking differentiated parts. I said, that's kind of clunky. I'm going to call it integration, which, they use integration in a different way. Because here, the way we're going to use integration is it's the linking of differentiated parts where in the linkage, you do not lose the differentiation. So in terms of your question about, okay, I'm having an argument with my spouse, like this morning, this message came in from a neighbor and it was very disturbing. And I chose to differentiate and not bring it up first thing in the morning, but wait. And then the question was, why didn't I bring it up earlier? So I could, of course, so I could honor, okay, you want to know right away. I was going to let you have a nice, peaceful morning. But I could get all agitated about it and go into chaos or get shut down and rigid. But instead I honored her differentiated response, took a deep breath, allowed myself to have my differentiated judgment about what I chose to do. And she then, as we both got back into a faceless flow where we both got a little chaotic or a little rigid, after a few beats, she was able to say, next time, just do me a favor. Communication from neighbors counts as the thing you don't hold back. And I said, okay, because we've done this before with our kids. When we get a piece of information, do we bring it up when we're all busy doing this and that? Anyway, so then there's a state of harmony that's created. And, it's like the beautiful work from the Gottmans or from Ed Tronick that shows, it's not the fighting in a couple that determines things. It's really how you differentiate and link to reconnect after the fight that makes it.
Okay, wait. I'm going to stop you for a second.
Yeah, stop me for many seconds.
I really want our audience to hear that again. I really want to just sit with this notion that, and I think about where we are in our pandemic and where we are with our fractures and where we are with so many different examples, not just as individuals, but as cultural groups living in states of, vast acreage of chaos or rigidity. And would love to hear you speak to how paying attention to the way that you're describing and defining the mind, how that's then going to make a difference for us, whether it's my spouse or now, though, even on this larger scale, this larger stage, how we are operating in the middle of this pandemic.
Yeah, well, the pandemic we have now of a virus is just one of many pandemics. We have a pandemic of social injustice and racism. We have a pandemic of misinformation and polarization. We have a pandemic of attention addiction, and we have a pandemic of environmental destruction. So this question you're asking, Kurt, is so important and timely, but not just about the viral pandemic. Let's just say it's about all the pandemics, right? And I think one of the underlying pandemics that needs to be named that's actually causal, or if not just exacerbating, is the pandemic of the lie of the separate self, that we especially in modern times are thinking that the self is separate. So there's a number of ways of diving into this. One is to say that if integration is health, then an integrated self differentiates the inner experience of self with the relational experience of self. Relational being your connection with other people that are people not just in your friends or group or your family, but people who are in your community or people who are not like you, don't look like you, or don't share the same religious beliefs as you. So with all of humanity. But then we can say, well, it's also your relationship with all of nature, and you are a fundamental member of the family of life. And for those who are spiritually oriented and theistically oriented, you might say, what is your relationship with the universe? What's your relationship with God? And I know that in chronological time, we may be short on time, but I'll just say these truths that have emerged is that there seem to be 9 domains of integration. And when you go through each of the domains, you come to overlap in many ways with how we can approach the pandemics. And I'll just bring up the first of these 9 domains. It's the domain of the integration of consciousness. And I'll give you like a quick download because this is a neurofaith podcast. And I just want to say that if consciousness is necessary for change, which looks like it is, and integration is health, which looks like that's the case, then what if you integrated consciousness? So I would invite my patients and then my students and workshop participants to actually differentiate the knowing of being aware in the hub of a metaphoric wheel of awareness from the rim of things that are known, like what you hear or see or taste or touch, or what you feel inside your body, what you think or remember, and even your sense of relationships. Now, as people do this, and then ultimately in an advanced step would bend this singular spoke of attention they're moving around the rim actually into the hub, amazing things would happen. Amazing things would happen to people who were religious folk. Amazing things would happen to people who were non-religious folks. And amazingly, they were very similar. So then the thing that was kind of striking especially was what people experience with pure awareness in the hub. And, I collected with, 10,000 people I did this in person with before the pandemic, then another 40,000. I would record the survey data that people would give of their first person experiences now turned into second person data. I tried to correlate it with this third person information. And the bottom line is there wasn't anything really that I could find in brain studies that would correlate with what people were actually saying they experienced in that hub But here's what they experienced. And you tell me in your own background, Kurt, what comes up for you. They said, when I bent that spoke around into the hub, and now I'm giving you lots and lots and lots of reports now condensed into common statements. I felt so much peace. I felt joy. I felt like I was coming home. I felt God. I felt timelessness. I felt eternity. I was with the infinite. I was connected to everything. I had so much joy, so much gratitude. These are the things people would say over and over and over again. People were absolutely atheistic in their stance or religious. People who had been meditating for decades or had never meditated a day before in their life. It was remarkable.
So I'm gonna pause you with that and just say a couple things because what I don't want to do is shortchange this. And I want to, as you're speaking right here, Dan, I'm thinking a couple things. I'm thinking I really want us to come back and have an exploded conversation about the 9 domains of integration. I want to have you come back and do that at some point soon. But here's something that comes to mind. You asked me what comes to my mind. What comes to mind is the opening line of the 62nd Psalm, where we read, "For God alone, my soul waits in silence." And I think about the notion of how this practice of the integration of consciousness can draw our attention to being in a state of mind where peacefulness, this is oversimplifying because this is just using one word, where as we believers would say, the peace of Christ passes all understanding, pervades our experience. And I'm also just really aware of how the work that you're doing in giving us an awareness of, now this is going to sound, the word is it may not be completely helpful, but you're giving us an awareness of the mechanics. You're giving us an awareness of, we call it science, we call it mechanics, we call it how things are moving together. Our awareness of this gives us not just greater informational knowledge, but gives us a greater operational understanding. How can we apply these awarenesses of the mind, its emergent properties, its energy flow properties, our role in regulating that, and the practices of the integration of consciousness in particular, that can be the first step toward addressing, as you rightly say, a multitude of pandemics for which it will require all of our work together in order to respond to that in a fully helpful way that can enable us to flourish. Dan, we could talk forever and a day. I know that I can't get you to commit right here and now to this, but I really want to have you come back and have us talk more explicitly about those 9 domains.
Sure, I'm happy to.
And I want our audience to, before we wrap up, Dan, I would love, if the audience would like to find out more about you, find out more about what you're doing, what would be the best way for them to do that?
If they're capable of, doing more screen time, they could go online to a website, drdansiegel.com, DRDANSIEGEL.com. And there you'll see a bunch of things you can get involved in, including doing the Wheel of Awareness. But you'll explore, all sorts of domains of integration, the courses we have, and there are resources of all sorts, including our Mindsight Institute website link that's there. And there's a community of people that are gathering there, from spiritual traditions, indigenous traditions, scientific traditions, music, literature, all sorts of ways of understanding what it means to be human and how we can make this a better world for all of us.
So to our audience, you've been listening to the Neurofaith podcast today with Dan Siegel, my friend and colleague and leader in this field that continues to grow, this field of interpersonal neurobiology. Dan, thank you so much for your time. And for those of us who are new to the Neurofaith podcast, please join us at our next broadcast, and we look forward to being with you.